Hey there, art nerds. Today I'm going to walk you through my process of painting this magnolia within the state of Louisiana. I have two of these, a magnolia and an iris, and I look forward to sharing both of them with you guys. I don't normally do a lot of realistic painting since I just happen to enjoy doing cartooning so much, but these were painted for some of my Louisiana shows at the end of fall 2022, and they ended up being quite popular. So let me know if you guys want to see more of this kind of stuff from me. I want to say from the jump that this illustration took several hours, about 2 to 3 days to paint, and has been time-lapsed significantly. I started out with a digital sketch that I printed out onto Canson Moulin watercolor paper, and now I'm stretching it onto Gatorboard. So not only does this give it some structural support while I'm painting it so it doesn't bend and wrinkle all over the place, but it also reactivates the blue dyes in the printer ink and makes them lift up, and I can remove them from the paper. So when I stretch watercolor illustrations, it usually serves a couple of purposes. I'm using 3M's low tack blue painter's tape, the crepe kind, to stretch my illustration to the board, and I'm using bulldog and binder clips to hold it secure while it dries. I find that this method works the best for me. The Gator board is lightweight and the bulldog clips hold everything nice and tight. So I'm going to start by kind of blocking in my magnolia. I'm also using my trusty spray bottle of water to get some of those pigments to move a bit more. I want this to feel, while it's somewhat realistic, I do want it to feel loose and kind of playful. I'm adding a little bit of orange down at the bottom of the magnolia cone, and I'm going to use a neutral tint to underpaint the magnolia blossoms. We have a magnolia bloom at the top and then an opened magnolia blossom at the bottom, and I'm working heavily from reference for this. I'm not trying to recreate it 100% exactly, but I am trying to capture the feel of those large, thicker petals, to capture the weight and to capture the color accurately. And since these are so lightly colored, I figured an underpainting with neutral tint would probably be one of the best ways to start establishing those shadows and establishing those forms, and then I can just kind of glaze my colors on top of that. At this point, the underpainting does look pretty extreme and fairly dark. It is going to lighten up quite a bit as it dries, and it's not going to be as noticeable once I start glazing the layers of color on it. I am working with silver black velvet round watercolor brushes, as well as a Paul Rubens quill, which I happen to really like. And if you're on the market for a quill or a good large round watercolor brush, Paul Rubens are pretty good and fairly economical compared to other quills of comparable quality. Once I've got my underpainting pretty established, I'm going to mix up kind of a creamy color using yellow ochre, some browns, and a little bit of red. And I'm going to glaze this on top of our existing layers. Since magnolias come in a variety of colors, usually warmer tones, you do have some white magnolias, but I really wanted to capture kind of the creaminess of the magnolia blossoms that we have most predominantly here in Southeast Louisiana. I start with a fill wash for both of these flowers, and then while it's still wet, I'm going in and adding additional colors. So a little bit of kind of like an Indian yellow, a little bit of orange, just so that we can kind of capture those subtle colors that you see when you look at magnolia blossoms. While that dries, I'm going to go back into the center of our magnolia with a light wash of green, and then going in with a darker green as well as green gold, allowing it to kind of blend wet into wet. And then while that dries, I'm going in with a little bit of burnt sienna to start painting in some of the shadows on the magnolia blossoms. Brushwork is an area that I'm working on, but still not quite as proficient as I'd like to be. And it was an area that I really leaned heavily on for this illustration so that I could capture some of the loose freshness that these magnolia blossoms kind of embody. So for the giant magnolia leaves, I'm starting with a light wash of green gold, and then I'm dipping in, it's either a red or a reddish orange. It's hard for me to tell, and I apologize, along the edges so that it blends out wet into wet. I'm also adding in a little bit of a warmer yellow, because if you look at magnolia blossoms, they aren't just green. There's different areas with different color, and then how the light is hitting the leaves can really kind of change how they're perceived. So that's what I mean when I say I'm working really heavily from reference for this one. So to paint in the shadows, I'm using indigo, and I'm really trying to capture kind of the striation of the leaves, paying really close attention to what I'm seeing and blocking in the color and then blending it out quite a bit so that we get kind of this diffused blend of color. It's not just so like neat and tidy, but I do want those striations to still be really visible. I'm also going back in with some more indigo just to kind of darken some of the shadows and allow that to diffuse out as well. This is kind of an underpainting for those leaves. I am going to paint a layer of green on top of it. And then for the center of our blossom, I'm going back in with an orange, and I'm painting kind of, I'm sorry, I do not have the terminology, but I believe this holds on to the pollen for the magnolia blossoms. So I'm painting that with orange and then going back in with red to add some additional color and a little bit of additional vibrancy and to make it pop a bit more. I've allowed everything to dry, and now I'm going in with some removable masking fluid and a synthetic brush. I'm going to mask off those areas that I just painted with orange, and we're going to paint the center of the magnolia blossom. I'm going to allow that to dry fully, and then we can go in with kind of a cooler, more vibrant green, dabbing in some hooker's green as well for some shadows. And then while that's drying, I'm going to go ahead and use undersea green to paint in the majority of the leaves. Now, you guys definitely do not have to use the same colors as I'm using. I'm just mentioning it in case you happen to like a color and want to be able to replicate it. But undersea green is one of the most used colors in my palette. It's a granulating green that also contains some brown, some gold, and some blue in it. And it's just a really useful color. So to paint the state itself, I'm using cerulean blue, and it kind of reminds me of the blue skies that we get in winter time. And I think that's what I'm trying to channel for this, is like that really bright, brilliant winter sky blue that Louisianians know and love most of the time. Sometimes we end up getting really cold spells or really weird, hot, soggy winters, but this always kind of reminds me of winter and Christmas time. In fact, if I look out my window right now, the sky is this same color. That first layer, while the color is really pretty, it dried pretty patchy as well. So I'm going over it again with a second layer of the same cerulean blue. I'm going to add some more shadows to our Magnolia blossoms using that same neutral tint. And something that I think is kind of interesting is different companies' neutral tints are all a little bit different. Neutral tint is designed as a color that can be mixed with other colors to darken them without desaturating them too much. I'm also going back in with a more opaque yellow, I believe it's bismuth yellow, and adding that around the edges of the Magnolia blossom to make it look a little bit more sun-kissed. I'm also going to use that same bismuth yellow in the center of the leaves for the vein. Once everything's had kind of a chance to dry, I'm using my masking fluid pickup to pick up the masking fluid from the center of the Magnolia blossom, and I'm just going to start kind of adding additional layers of orange and kind of cleaning things up. I'm going to add some more indigo to the leaves to kind of give some more shadow and give them some more form, since I felt like the yellow kind of flattened them out a bit. This is also kind of cleaning up the leaves a bit. Once things had a chance to dry, I'm going back into the center of our Magnolia blossom with some opaque yellow, and I'm just kind of highlighting the pollen on the center just to kind of delineate it a little bit more and make it pop a little bit more. I'm also using a smaller round for this because it's a little bit easier to control the color as well as the water. At this point, it's a lot of just adjusting things, adjusting the colors, adjusting the shadows, adding in additional layers, really kind of working against the reference as well as what looks good in my mind. I'm not really looking for like a particular thing. I'm just looking for it to feel right. Now, a piece of interesting watercolor art advice I've seen on TikTok that I'd actually like to try out is to check the contrast. You can use like a red piece of glass or a red piece of plastic, and that's going to kind of flatten out all the colors and make it easier to judge the contrast. And that's something I would definitely like to try out in the future to see if that works for me and maybe helps me figure out when I'm finished so I don't overwork as many pieces as much as I do, because I'm always looking for what I have referred to in the past as like visual bounce. There has to be a good amount of darkness, there has to be a good amount of midtones, and there has to be a good amount of highlights or our lightest tones. And often I'll end up going back in with watercolor pencils to add back in some of those lighter tones and to kind of adjust the contrast. Speaking of, once my watercolor illustration has dried, I'm going in with watercolor pencils. And I have a few favorites. I happen to really like the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer. Those are really India ink pencils, as well as the Derwent Inktense pencils. Again, India ink. I also really like Caran d'Ache's Supracolor II and their Museum Aquarelle. And what I really like about watercolor pencils with my watercolor illustration is it allows me to add a layer of brightness and opacity, and then I can blend that out with water. And I'm able to do that with a lot of nuance, and being able to add opacity back into your watercolor illustrations, being able to add those highlights back in can be very helpful. So I'm using a smaller round watercolor brush with some neutral tint just to kind of outline the petals themselves, add a little bit of thinner shadow, and to kind of delineate things. I'm also using a cream colored watercolor pencil to add some of those rim highlights back into the petals themselves, and to just kind of clean up some of the chaos we've created that's going to kind of tie things together and make it feel more coherent. But I really love how some of the blues have bled into the petals. There's something just really satisfying to me about that when it comes to watercolor. I just think it's really beautiful. And it's something that I try to bring into my work frequently because it's an aspect of watercolor that's unique to watercolor that digital watercolor often fails to replicate, and that I just happen to really enjoy. For my final white highlights, I've pulled out my white gouache. I'm going to use it pretty sparingly. Something I've noticed about white gouache is that unless you adjust it with other colors, it can actually be a little bit too cool and it can deaden your illustrations. That's one of the reasons I really like the cream colored watercolor pencil, is that you can add some of that light back in without necessarily flatten things out or deadening them too much. But a little bit sparingly used here and there on our magnolias helps to create additional rim lighting. It adds some additional light values, and it really makes things start to pop. And I'm using a two brush technique here where I'm lining with the white gouache, and then I'm using my second larger brush that has clean water in it to kind of blend that line out so that it's not quite so striking, and so that it kind of blends in with the illustration a little bit better. my favorite art teachers over the years kind of refer to this going back and forth and adding things and adjusting things and fixing things as kind of massaging the piece into place. And that's kind of how I think about it as well, where you do a thing, you step back, you think about it, and then you come back again and you maybe do another thing and you're just kind of picking at it. It's hard to really articulate exactly what you're looking for, and I apologize because it's one of the concepts that I also struggle with, and I really wish I could better put into words what I'm looking for and what I'm aiming for. If I could better put into words, I think I would have more successful watercolor pieces than I do, or more pieces that I am proud of and that I feel good about. But it's just this like je ne sais quoi, this certain something that when you've hit it, you know you've hit it. So I'm adding a little bit more contrast to the center of the magnolia flower. And then once everything has had a chance to dry, I'm carefully pulling away my blue painter's tape, pulling it at a 90-degree angle. So if it does tear, it doesn't tear into the watercolor illustration. And there we have it. This one is probably very, very niche. I've noticed I don't have a lot of fellow Louisianians hanging out on my YouTube channel. But I hope you guys enjoyed painting along with me, particularly the magnolia blossoms. I sure enjoyed painting with you guys. If you like this illustration, this is available as a print in 9x12 and 10x14 sizes. So ready to frame sizes over at the Natto shop at nattosoup.com/shop. You'll also find prints of a lot of my other watercolor illustrations there. I hope you guys will check it out. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I took a poll over on the community tab asking what you guys would like to see more of from me in 2023, and I was honestly surprised by how many of you guys said tutorials. So I'm really going to try to up the number of tutorials that I share this year. So thank you guys so much for hanging out with me, and a huge thank you to my amazing patrons on Patreon. Thank you guys so much.